If I look around this room of Oxford undergraduates, 40% of you were privately educated in a country in which 7% of students have private educations. 80% of you come from meaningful social and economic privilege. As we heard a moment ago, at my university, Yale, there are more students from the top 1% of the income distribution than from the entire bottom half. Now, my university's admissions process is corrupt, and failures of meritocracy might explain it. But Oxford's is not corrupt. You can't buy a place here. There is no meaningful legacy preference. And yet, nevertheless, you're all rich, and you all come from privileged backgrounds, or almost all. Now, why is that? The reason is straightforward. Famous US baseball player once said, "Practice doesn't make perfect, perfect practice makes perfect." Meritocracy, in fact, is not, as we just heard, that advantage turns on effort and talent. It turns on effort and talent, and one more thing, investment. It turns on how much is invested in developing a child's talent using their own efforts. And the investment that different kinds of children get in meritocratic societies is absolutely enormously different. In the United States, the richest private schools spend over $75,000 per pupil per year on educating their children, in a society in which public schools on average spend about $12,000. In this country, the richest private schools spend over £30,000 a year educating their children. These massive investments produce massive differences in childhood achievement, not because of legacy admissions, but because when you get trained, you get good at things. And the result, therefore, is that a meritocracy, when it works as designed, favors those whose parents are in a position best to invest in them, who have the money, who have the skills, and who have the free energy and space to do so. And believe me, meritocrats give rich parents the ability to do so. I'll get it in 1 second. When Michael Young invented the term meritocracy, the richest in England had only half the share of national income that they have today. The richest 10% of earners made twice as much as the poorest 10% of earners. Today, they make 4 times as much. A graduate of this university will make 50% more in her first year out than a graduate of the University of York. So meritocracy creates an inequality in which rich parents have the opportunity to spend all this money on their children, which is why meritocratic children are also rich children. That's the first point. Meritocracy excludes most of society from meaningful advantage. Second point, it's not actually fun to have that much invested in you as a kid. It's not easy. You are poked and prodded and tested and subject to tutors and classes and extra help and schools and exams. And you do this from the earliest age up until adulthood. And then you come here and you work hard, and then you get a job at McKinsey or Goldman Sachs and you work 80 hours a week. And then you become parents. And you live in fear that your children will lose the caste that you have acquired by working so hard. And so as parents, you do 2 jobs. You squeeze into your children the same thing that was squeezed into you as you're working to try to make the money to enable you to do that. It's not surprising that in England, exam anxiety has now overtaken body image as the largest source of stress in wealthy children. It's not surprising that in a study of a wealthy American private school, 50% of children had moderate to severe clinical symptoms of depression, and 75% had moderate to severe clinical symptoms of anxiety. These are not easy lives to live. You will be extremely wealthy, wealthier than you can imagine, wealthier than prior elites have been, but you will not be well, and your children will not be well. And so even as meritocracy excludes everyone else, it will ensnare those of us in this room who are fortunate. But that doesn't mean that in human terms it serves our interests. And so meritocracy creates an elite that is indifferent to the common good and that believes in its own entitlements, which is very damaging for society and not so great for the elite either. At the same time, meritocracy tells the rest of society that it's their fault that they aren't in this room. That if they'd been a little more talented, if they'd been a little harder working, if they'd been a little more virtuous, if they'd had a little more merit, then they would have been able to measure up. They would have succeeded. And so they are to blame for what is in fact a form of structural exclusion. And so meritocracy makes the elite smug and leaves everyone else naked in their rejection. And that's an extremely damaging place to be. That explains why in your country and in my country, those who are excluded by meritocracy now have a lower life expectancy than they did 3 years ago. Let me be clear, there has been no other time and place in human history in which, absent war or massively fatal plague, and COVID is not that plague, there's been a diminution in life expectancy for a large segment of the population. The source is addiction, the source is alcoholism, the source is obesity, the source is suicide. These are internalized forms of self-hatred produced by what meritocracy says to the people whom it excludes, just as neoliberalism and Davos are internalized forms of conceit produced by what meritocracy says to the elite. So once again, meritocracy excludes most people from advantage. It ensnares the rich in a web of effort and distortion. And it distorts all of us individually and collectively, making us value the wrong things in the wrong ways and for the wrong reasons, which is, as the motion says, why there is no merit in meritocracy, or why, as I would say, merit is a sham.
What's up, my good people? I hope you're doing good from wherever you're watching me from, and I want just to welcome you back to the channel once again. Welcome back for another very interesting and very educative video or episode. And in this episode, we're going to talk about merit and the concept behind the word merit, which is meritocracy. And what comes to our minds when we think about merit and meritocracy is probably trying to attach the word to success and achievement, or maybe that social and economic reward will always try to follow talent, effort, and achievement. That the most academically gifted students get the top spots in the best academic institutions, or the most skilled professional worker tends to get the highest and the best paying job in a firm or in a company, in a certain job. That is what we tend to think when we talk about merit and meritocracy. But what if I told you that the truth is that that is what the system wants you to believe, which is far, far from what is happening just beneath the surface? Underneath the surface, the exact opposite is taking place. So without wasting so much of your time, I want us to listen to this Yale professor who's going to educate us so much on this. Please, let's watch, let's carefully listen in and learn. And at the end of this, we'll have something to take home. So let's go for it.
Yale law professor Daniel Markovits says the system that values hard work and promotes the American dream is, in itself, a sham. He joins our Hari Srinivasan to discuss his dramatic thesis that meritocracy, in fact, feeds inequality and undermines democracy.
There's kind of an implied equality of opportunity in meritocracy, right? There's this notion that I have just as good a chance as you, and that's why we should all believe in this system and this construct.
Right. So that's the thing that I want to push back against, exactly. We have this idea that if you're judged on the merits, there's equal opportunity for everybody. The problem is that when some people have a lot more resources to train their children than other people, then even when the kids get judged on the merits down the road, those who got the most training will have the most merit. And that's not because they're naturally smarter or more virtuous or harder working. It's because their parents invested in them in a way in which nobody else's parents could. And so that effect, we can talk about all the ways in which it happens and how big it is, but it's enormous. And it has the consequence that now the rich and the richest kids win the meritocratic competition and everybody else loses.
You talk a lot about the gaps in education. Give me some examples of how that plays out.
So this starts long before people are even born. If you look at the family structure of rich families and the family structure of middle class and poor families, rich kids are much, much more likely to be born into families with both parents still in the household. If you are a woman without a high school degree, or even with a high school degree but no college degree in the United States today, you will have roughly 60% of your children outside of wedlock. If you're a woman with a graduate degree, you'll have only 5% of your children outside of wedlock. So right from the get-go, kids of rich, educated parents have both parents in the household, and other kids usually don't. And then the rich parents just start spending money on their kids. You know, a typical public high school in the United States spends maybe $15,000 a year per child to educate the kids. A really poor high school might spend $8,000 or $10,000 a year, so that's a gap of about $5,000. But the top 20 private schools, as measured by Forbes, spend on average $75,000 a year per child to educate their kids. And all that money buys results. It buys training, it buys teacher attention, it buys careful educational programs. And when it comes time to take the SAT, for example, kids whose parents earn more than $200,000 a year have 250-point higher scores on average than middle-class kids, even as middle-class kids have just 125 points higher on average than kids below the poverty line.
So the gap between the very wealthy and the middle class is much higher than the middle class and the poor.
Much higher, twice as big on the SAT. And on other measures, the gap is even bigger. And the gap between the rich and the poor is truly enormous.
You know, culturally, we seem to have bought into it, some cultures more than others. Indian parents, Asian parents, they are into the meritocracy from the get-go. You know, look, if you just work hard, we were immigrant parents here, we want you to get this best opportunity. The way through is to hit the books, right? I mean, that's, and at some levels, they see role models that have made it to elite Ivy League academies and say, great, that was this person's ticket out. She became a doctor, he became a lawyer. We have transcended our class.
And I think there are two kinds of responses to that, other than saying, of course, it's true for some people. The first sort of response is, it's not good to make social policy based on exceptional cases. Exceptional cases are charismatic for us, they're inspiring for us, but most of us are ordinary, not exceptional. And so if you want to have a fair society and a well-functioning society, it has to be a society in which ordinary people in ordinary circumstances can do well. The second is that there is a generational transformation here, which is that the elite that is now middle-aged probably did win through that system, partly because, as you said at the beginning, the old aristocracy was very unfair to lots of groups, to people of color, to immigrants, to Jews, to Catholics. And the old aristocrats were not particularly skilled or hardworking. So when meritocracy was invented, it was a great way for those groups to use their natural ability and their industry to get ahead. But what's now happened is the people who won that lottery and won that system are now the elite. And they know how to train their kids like nobody's business. And they out-train. And this is true now across ethnic groups, across religions. So the rich train really well and really hard, and their kids get ahead, not because they cheat, but because they're taught.
Someone's watching this interview, they're Googling your name, and they're saying, look at this guy. He's a professor at Yale Law School. He's gone to all these good schools. The meritocracy has worked for him. He worked hard. He went to the best of the best. Yeah. What's wrong with this?
So it's been great for me. I want to be very clear about that. Whatever advantages I have, I owe to exactly the system that I'm now attacking. So this is not meant to be holding myself out as a role model for anything. This is an argument about, you know, facts and logic. I also do think, though, there are some parts of my own experience that led me to this book. I went to public high school in Austin, Texas, would now be called an urban public high school. I went to high school with kids whose parents were not professionals. My parents were, who were just as smart as I was in 9th grade. And I know that because we'd have a homework assignment and they could do the problem and I couldn't. And now they're not nearly as wealthy or as credentialed as I am. And the question is, what's the difference? And a big part of the difference is that over the course of the rest of my childhood, I got a kind of support and training from my parents who knew how to train me that's much harder for middle and working class kids to get when their parents haven't gone through the system and don't know how to train.
So you are basically saying that you are a product of these massive sustained advantages that are structural, that you had two academic parents that could help you. You might have gotten breaks along the way from professors who might have given you the benefit of the doubt.
Right, both the benefit of the doubt and also just attention. You know, when I was an undergraduate at Yale College, the amount of attention I got from my professors, just training, when I got something wrong, they would call me up and say, listen, you couldn't do that problem. Let me talk you through it. If I'm at the University of Texas, my professor with 20 times as many students can't do that. And education really works. And so the consequence of this is that the people who get the most of it do the best in the system that we have now.
The Ivy Leagues are a very, relatively speaking, small group of schools when we look at the entire crop of people that graduate or enter higher education every year, right? They're going to say, you know, we are selective, we want the brightest, we're not going to lower our standards to try to just diversify by socioeconomic class. We serve the public interest. What is wrong with the version of reality that they're living in versus what's happening outside their walls?
So I think there are two kinds of problems here. The first is just with what happens inside the Ivy League. In the Ivy League and the Ivy Plus colleges today, there are more students whose parents are in the top 1% of the income distribution than the entire bottom half. So these universities educate overwhelmingly very rich kids. The second thing is that even though they function as clubs for the elite, they're taxed as charities, so that alumni donations are tax deductible, their endowments can grow without taxation. And that's an enormous public subsidy. So somebody recently calculated that Princeton's tax exemption amounts to a public subsidy of $100,000 a year per pupil, per student at Princeton. Compare that to Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, it gets public subsidies of about $12,500 a year. And Essex County Community College up the road gets public subsidies of about $2,500 a year. So the really rich kids at Princeton get a bigger public subsidy, 40 times bigger, than the middle and working class kids at the local community college. And that's not a just system. The second point I think is also really important, which is that the graduates of these universities then go out into the workforce and they transform the labor market. They transform how jobs are done. They transform industries. They transform industries to favor exactly the kind of fancy educations that they have. So that what happens as a result of this in finance, in something simple like taxi cab driving, you get a world in which it used to be there were middle-class jobs, and now there are elite jobs and impoverished jobs. So taxi drivers used to be middle-class people. You could make a living, you could support a family as a cab driver. It was a skilled job, you needed to know the city. Then Uber comes in, and what Uber does is some very super skilled people with extremely fancy educations design technology that strips all the skill from the driver and has them just follow apps, gets them paid much, much less. And now the driver, there's no way they can rise through the Uber hierarchy to become an elite Uber manager. And they can't afford to send their kids to the schools that elite Uber managers go to. And so you get the inequality in education driving a transformation of work that makes work unequal. And then you get the people who do well at work sending their kids to the fancy schools and the system snowballs. And that's not good.
You point out in the book a distinction between an excellent versus a superior education system. Play that out for us.
Yeah, so excellence as a concept has two properties. The first is it's a threshold concept, not a rank concept. So when we say that someone's excellent, if someone else is better at something, that doesn't make the first person not excellent anymore. So when you're excellent, you're good at something. You can do something worthwhile. And the second thing is that excellence is tied to an evaluation of what it is you're good at. It makes sense to say you're an excellent doctor. It doesn't make sense to say you're an excellent torturer or you're an excellent fraudster. So there's a kind of a substantive ethics of excellence. Superiority, on the other hand, is different in both respects. Superiority is a rank concept, so that if you're better than I am, I'm no longer superior. And we can talk about being superior without mentioning whether the thing I'm superior at is worth doing or not. And so our education system, because it's become meritocratic, because it's competitive, has abandoned the idea of excellence, the idea of making people good at things that are worth doing, and embraced the idea of superiority, making people better than others at competitions without looking as to whether those competitions are particularly valuable or not. That's why the Ivy League now, for example, produces such an enormous number of people who go into finance, which is the quintessential superiority game. There's no evidence that modern finance benefits society, but it makes those who do well at it incredibly rich, and you got to be better than the next guy. And, you know, a place like Yale or Princeton or Harvard, the top two jobs that people go into out of these universities are finance and consulting.
So how do you restructure our education system?
You would put a lot of pressure on elite schools and universities, not just Ivy League universities, but from kindergarten up, to educate many, many more students and to focus much less intensively on rich kids. So the Ivy League today spends about twice as much per student per year as it did in 2000. There's no reason that these universities couldn't take twice as many students. There's no reason that elite private schools, which have student-teacher ratios that are twice as favorable as public schools, couldn't double their enrollments. And one way to do this is to tell these institutions, again, from kindergarten up through graduate school, that if you don't admit more students and admit more economically diverse students, you lose your tax exemption. The second thing you could do is various interventions in the labor market in order to encourage people to make and hire people for mid-skilled jobs, particularly changing the Social Security tax system so that it no longer favors elite workers over middle-class workers.
You're also saying that this system, the meritocratic system, does not work for the elites.
Yeah.
Explain that.
Yeah, so earlier we talked about the fact that having rich parents is almost a necessary condition for getting ahead in our society, because you need them to invest in your education as only rich parents can do. At the same time, our education system has become so competitive and our workplace has become so competitive that having rich parents isn't close to a sufficient condition. So that even if you have all the privilege in the world, unless you're willing to cheat and can get away with it, you may not get in. If you look at a place like the University of Chicago in the 1990s, there was a year in which it admitted something like 70% of its applicants. Last year, I think the University of Chicago admitted about 6.5% of its applicants. Stanford admits fewer than 5% of its applicants. What this means...
Well, they brag about that.
They brag about that. Yale brags about the fact that our admissions rate is the lowest it's ever been, our yield is the highest it's ever been. And what it means, though, concretely, even for rich kids, is that if you ever made a big mistake in your childhood, you're not getting in. If something went wrong, if you fell in love and ignored all your studies for your sophomore year of high school, you're not getting in. If you took a chance on taking some classes that were too hard for you and did really badly, you're not getting in. And what that means is that the elites are privileged by all this training, but they're also enslaved and tortured and twisted and oppressed by all of the training and competition that they have to get into them and surmount in order to stay ahead. And so this is not a good system for the rich either.
Okay, it's going to be hard for a taxi driver to feel that pity for somebody who's in the back of the cab earning millions of dollars as a partner at a law firm. Why is their life tough?
So I get that. And I think we need to distinguish between two kinds of sympathy. There's a kind of political sympathy, which is a reason for people to make sacrifices for others. And then there's a kind of existential sympathy, which is just the recognition that everybody's life is the only life they have. And you can be owed nothing by anybody and be a proper object of political scorn, and yet deserve existential sympathy. And the reason why this is important is that the system that we have will not get undone unless we can persuade the elites that it's not working for them either. And so the argument that this system is oppressing the rich isn't made by me because I have great sympathy for the rich, but because it's true. And if they can come to believe it's true, then they're going to be much more amenable to a politics and a policy that will unwind the inequality that we have.
There's something in our psyche that it's an incredibly strong narrative that we convince ourselves, especially if we've gone through these meritocratic systems. If you are that surgeon or whatever, if you are that banker that has specialized, invested in it, you say, wait a minute, this is something that I have earned. Someone is trying to take it away from me, either through taxation or you're asking me to, give everybody else a chance. That they didn't go through these hoops. They didn't get hazed. They didn't have to put those long hours, right? I suffered.
I think that's exactly right. A couple books have recently been written by political scientists and historians surveying concentrated wealth at the top across societies, across all of history, across all of space. And these are careful scholars, so they wouldn't put this as crassly as I am. But one way to summarize those books is that in all of human experience, if you look at the societies that have concentrated wealth and privilege as powerfully and as narrow an elite as the United States has today, across all of experience, there's only one case in which that's been unwound, without losing a war or succumbing to a revolution. So elites cling to their privilege, and they have to be forced out of it. That's why I'm making this argument that this kind of privilege doesn't benefit even the rich.
You're saying if they are not able to be persuaded, it will happen one way or another.
It will happen one way or another, and it will happen in a way that is bad for everybody, or it can be brought about in a way that, in fact, serves the real human interests, even of the rich.
You talk a little bit about what's happening politically right now, too. There's a quote I want to read. Progressives inflame middle-class resentment and trigger elite resistance, while demagogues and charlatans monopolize and exploit meritocracy's discontents. Meritocratic inequality, therefore, induces not only deep discontent, but also widespread pessimism verging on despair. Are we there now?
Well, I think we certainly are at the pessimism and approaching the despair phase. And I think the mechanism that you describe is exactly the one I want to emphasize, which is that think about where we began. We began with the idea that meritocracy is a virtuous system that gives everybody a fair shot at success. And then we described the ways in which the rich buy education for their children that is really a form of structural exclusion of the middle class and the working class. Now what meritocracy says, if you're middle class and working class, it says the reason you didn't get ahead is that you individually failed to measure up, that it's your problem. You didn't work hard enough. You're not talented enough. When in fact, it's that there was a structural system that excluded you. But if you're told your own struggles are your fault and your inadequacy, then a demagogue who comes in and says, no, 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 the system is against you, is going to be extremely appealing. And what's happening in our politics now is that the anger of people who are excluded structurally, and then the economic injury is coupled with a moral insult, they're told it's their fault, are understandably frustrated and lashing out. And they're lashing out in politics, and they're lashing out in their personal lives. The opioid epidemic is very much related to this. This is a kind of self-medication for people who are deprived of opportunity and then told it's their fault. So a lot of these problems are the result of the extremely dark internal moral and psychological workings of the kind of inequality that we have.
Daniel Markovits, thanks so much.
Listen, thank you so much for this. It's been a real pleasure.
All right, welcome back. So that is such a very interesting, a very educative video by the professor right there. And I thought this is very important because if we were only interested and willing to engage in such uncomfortable, meaningful and truthful conversations like this, then we probably could be able to upset the system. Because the most important questions are today are, how did we get to where we are today? And especially as Black people who, I can say in majority, belong to either the middle or even the lower classes, how did we get here? Because it's not true that you can say that 90% of the world population, which that makes up for the middle and lower class, are lazy or not so good, and while the few elites that make up maybe the 5% of the world population are the most hardworking. It simply says, and we've heard from the professor right there, that hard work in itself is simply not enough. Going to school and working so hard and reading your books and following all the stated conventional ways to success are just simply not enough. You don't want to tell us that all Black people, because most Black people do rank, in the lower cadre of the socioeconomic status, are lazy. No, it is because a system has been designed in which it's meant to put you right down below, and the system does not love to be upset or to be changed, because the elite that have the keys to the system want to keep controlling the system to their favor. All right. And if we look at statistics, the statistics have it that since around the 1970s, we have a few elites really becoming far much more rich, while there is a distant second for the middle class, who are even closer to the lower class. And social mobility is continuously becoming very tough. It's becoming like a caste system where you cannot leave your caste or the category in which you find yourself in. It could be the lower class, the lower middle, the lower upper, or the middle class. You can't move from the middle class to the super rich, to the elite, and neither can the poor, the extremely poor people, move up the ladder, because the system is designed to put you to have the status quo retained as it is. And just as I made a small summary of this professor's book, which is called The Meritocracy Trap, and I have a few points that I try to summarize together. Maybe you can just go through these points quickly and know what this entails. So in his book, The Meritocracy Trap, Daniel Markovits says meritocracy, once meant to promote fairness, now perpetuates inequality. It was designed to replace inherited privilege with achievement-based advancement, but it has actually evolved into a system that mostly benefits the wealthy. That means, it has actually lost the meaning from which it was designed to serve. Elite education actually fuels the cycle. Like, the rich parents can invest heavily in their children's education, giving them a significant advantage in a system that rewards academic credentials. Okay, academics still plays a role. Okay, we are not actually completely and entirely discrediting education, but what kind of education do you need to get to, or to give to your children, so that they can break free from the system? That is now the problem. The problem is the kind of skills, the kind of knowledge, the kind of school generally from which your children can break free from being captured by the system, is what has become completely inaccessible for most people. And then again, he continues to say in another point that meritocratic jobs are exploitative, and that is high achieving professionals, that like lawyers, jobs, or even bankers, work extremely long hours, and their labor helps concentrate wealth and power in whose hands? The hands of the elite, making the system punishing even for the so-called winners, those that might have been the exceptional cases that manage to break free. But the professor also goes ahead to tell us that we cannot base we cannot check on societal advantages by basing our arguments on special special cases, because when we talk about the exceptional people in society, which we have, regardless of race, for example, but that make up for a very small part of the community. We can have very exceptionally gifted students in education, but that is not the ordinary. And most people belong to the ordinary. So we need to make societal conclusions or research or policies in accordance to what would probably work with the ordinary people. And something else I found from this book is the middle class suffers the most. They can't afford to compete with the elite in education or the career prep or preparation, and are increasingly excluded from what I just mentioned, which is mobility, social especially upward mobility, is really, really completely almost becoming impossible to move up to where the elites belong. And while it's actually easier to move down the ladder. So meritocracy disguises inequality as fairness. People at the top believe they earned their places, which makes them less sympathetic to the struggles of others and resistant to reform. So Markovits argues that systematic change, rethinking education, labor, and opportunity, so that success isn't hoarded by a small overworked elites. So this is a very, very, very important conversation that we need to really invoke, really have, in our circles, because the only thing we, in fact, as Black people, that can help us out of the status quo or out of a system that has been designed to place us just at the bottom of the pyramid, is if we know the truth and we try to upset the system. And upsetting the system needs you to have information on how the system works. And because you can't go to a battle that you don't know what's happening in the battlefield, you need to know what is going on. You have to have the information from which and from what points you can actually attack. I don't know what you think about this very educative topic of today. You might want to share your thoughts and your opinions in the comments of this video. Plus, you can also like and share this video. And if you're coming across this channel, you're highly welcome. Please give this video a thumbs up and share this video. But most importantly, subscribe to this channel to be part of us. So until next time, I would be happy to see you in the next video. Peace out.